Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture for Core 202. Today, we're going to talk about the Communist Manifesto, one of the most widely read, but also most widely misunderstood manifestos of all time. So everybody get ready to become a communist, and let's get started. So let's begin, as we always do, by talking a little bit about the authors. So really, there are two authors here, even though Marx always gets the credit, but Friedrich Engels did a lot. So we'll talk about Marx first. So, here he is. And he was born in Prussia, which of course no longer exists, but was very big at the time. It was a major part of Western Europe. I'm sure you've heard of the Prussian Empire. These days, basically the part where he was born is Germany. So, Marx bounced around a lot over the course of his life. He spent a good part of his life in England, he spent part of it in Paris, and basically he got kicked out of a lot of places. And this started early. So basically, if we look at Marx's education, you'll start to see this pattern develop. So he went to what was essentially high school at Trier, which is basically the city where that was. But what's interesting about that is that the school that he went to was known for its leftist agenda. So that might be where his radicalism started. Then he decided to go to his undergraduate at the University of Bonn. And he was studying philosophy there, but he was having kind of a rough time. He kept getting in fights. He actually got in a duel. He got kicked out. He was part of the drinking club. It was a whole thing. So after he left Bonn, he went to the University of Berlin. And technically he was studying law, but really he fell in with this group of young Hegelians, which was kind of a philosophy gang, which doesn't sound very dangerous, but they were considered very radical at the time. You'll just have to trust me. So he started kind of running with this radical crowd, and he did finish his education there, kind of. He ended up sort of sending his dissertation away to the University of Vienna, which was a college, but not a particularly well-respected college. It was kind of like getting an online degree or something like that. So basically, over the course of his education, he studied both philosophy and law. He didn't really study sociology because it hadn't quite been invented yet, but he is considered one of the primary sociologists today. Marx's personal life actually did have a lot to do with what he ended up writing and his success as an author. So basically, he was problematic. He had some really serious physical ailments, which might have been part of what explained his general grumpiness and his general drunkenness, but he was kept out of the army, and that made him really resentful. And then he married a woman who was very bright and a well-respected, intellectual in her age as well, but they were poor basically their entire lives. They lived in almost a complete state of poverty. Only a few of their children actually lived to adulthood. And at the end of their lives, they were pretty much sponsored by Engels. So over the course of his life, even though he was a well-respected writer, he was not necessarily a well-respected person. He kept getting kicked out of places and exiled out of places, and he was generally kind of difficult to get along with. So this did have an impact on what he was able to achieve, because reputation is everything. Marx's output as an author was actually pretty substantial. He worked for a lot of newspapers and journals, definitely, but he also took the time to write several books. We mostly talk about the Manifesto, even though it is quite short and he wrote it really quickly, but these are a couple of the other pieces that he published which are particularly famous. So first there was On the Jewish Question, which is not nearly as dark as it sounds. It's basically about immigration. I told you it's a problem with every generation. Then, of course, the Manifesto of the Communist Party. And then he started to get into what's called political economy, which is basically what we would call politics now, but there is definitely this overview of how money plays into our political decisions. So he was one of the foremost authors in that field. And then he wrote 3 volumes of Das Kapital, which are all pretty boring, but you probably will never have to read them. So even though he was in exile for so much of his life, he really did manage to get a lot of published work out there. So next, let's talk about Friedrich Engels. Engels was very cool. I don't think he gets enough credit for all the stuff he did. But basically, Engels was the son of a wealthy merchant, and his father essentially raised him to take over the family business. But while he was at college, he started secretly studying philosophy, and he started running with that same gang, the young Hegelians, and basically he got kind of radicalized. And so when he graduated and he went to work for his father, one of the things that his father did was to have him tour the factories. And that backfired. Because what happened was he started to talk to the workers at the factories. And he started to talk to people about how they were living and how much money they made and whether they were able to survive. And what he realized was, no, they weren't. He realized that the conditions of the working class were essentially much worse than anybody was acknowledging, and he was one of the first people to sort of make a connection between how the working class was doing and how the society was doing as a whole. So Engels was very important. So this is a short list of the things that Engels published over the course of his life. And one thing that's worth noting is that part of his life was influenced by this woman that he met while he was touring the factories. So she was an Irish radical named Mary, and they were together for most of their lives, even though they never married. And she was kind of his introduction into the working class and the people who lived and worked in the parts of town that he hadn't been to before. So basically, right out of school, he wrote an outline of a critique of political economy, which again was sort of about the relationship between politics and economics. Then he wrote this very important book, The Condition of the Working Class in England. A groundbreaking piece. Then, of course, he worked on the Manifesto, and for most of the rest of his life, he started to talk about families and the way that the family can implicate the policies that happen in the government and the way that that can implicate economics. It gets a little complicated. But basically, the main contribution that Engels made was, well, in part, supporting Marx, but also really drawing attention to the way that the working class was living, even though everybody else was largely ignoring it. So Marx and Engels both were known communists, which means that basically everyone knew that they were communist, and they knew that they were leaders of the Communist Party, and they knew that they were writing these publications. And this was dangerous, because it wasn't really popular to be communist at the time, and it certainly wasn't politically acceptable. So the two of them did have to live a lot of their lives in exile, and they did have to publish a lot of their pieces underground. But they were so well known in the communist community that they were asked to write the Manifesto. So the Manifesto itself was sort of commissioned by the Communist League, which was a group of men in England who were trying to basically convince everybody else that they should be communist. And they asked Marx and Engels to write it specifically. And they did. It took them about 6 weeks, which was actually longer than it was supposed to take them, and pretty long for what is basically a pamphlet. But they had a lot of problems while they were trying to write it, including drinking too much. So basically, the piece that they produced was not the piece that they meant to produce, but it is still one of our most important, lasting literary pieces. This is one of the most widely read books of all time. It is one of the most widely cited books of all time, but it's also one of the most misunderstood books of all time. I think one of the things that surprises people when they finally read the Communist Manifesto is that a lot of the ideas that are contained therein are kind of reasonable. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is what they wanted to happen, the situation that they were looking at, and the ways that they thought it could become better. So, let's dig in. In the introduction to the Manifesto, they basically open with this idea that communism is spreading and everyone's very worried. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. So basically he's saying that communism is starting to catch on. People are starting to become interested. And he says that the very fact that political forces are trying to push this down means two things. Number one, communism is powerful. They wouldn't be trying to suppress it unless they were actually worried about it. And number two, communism needs some structure. What they need is a manifesto. And so Marx is going to bring that to us now. So today, we're going to talk just about parts 1 and 2. So we'll begin with part 1, the beautifully named Bourgeois and Proletarians. So one of the things that I think is worth knowing about the Communist Manifesto is that it has some of the best opening and closing lines of all time. So here is the opening line. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. So basically, they're opening strong. All history is just one class fighting another class. They're arguing that all wars can be explained this way, all migrations can be explained this way, like all of the big things that we talk about in history, their argument can be explained by class struggles. So he goes on to talk about how we got to the classes that we have today. In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. So basically he's saying that throughout history we have seen people rank themselves. We find this gradation of social rank. It goes up, it goes down. The thing that he says is different is that we have two distinct classes right now. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinctive feature. It has simplified the class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. So you might have heard these terms before, or more specifically, you might have heard of like working people being called proles, or new money people being called bougie. That's where this comes from. So here is a quick definition of what he means by these two terms. Basically, the bourgeoisie is the class of capitalists. They're the people who own the means of production. They own the factories, they own the banks, they own the land. Basically, the bourgeoisie are the people who employ everybody else. Everybody else are proletarians. These are the workers, the employees. These are the people who rent, these are the people who basically have nothing to sell except for their own labor. So what they do in order to earn money is sell their labor. And Marx's point here is that instead of us having a sort of gradual social ranking with lots of places in the middle, there's just two. There's only top and bottom. And his argument is that it's divided by what you own. Specifically, whether you own something you can sell or whether the only thing you can sell is your labor. So the question becomes, okay, well, how did we get here? We see, therefore, how the modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and exchange. So that's what he's going to talk about next. These changes in the modes of production, these changes in the way that we exchange money and we exchange power. So first up, of course, power. The bourgeoisie has, at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself, in the modern representative state, exclusive political sway. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for the managing the common affairs for the whole bourgeoisie. So his argument here is that one of the things that makes the bourgeoisie so powerful is that they basically own the government. So his argument is that the government itself exists as kind of a board of directors for the bourgeoisie. One way to think about this in modern terms is lobbyists. So technically it is illegal for a person to just give a bunch of money to a politician and hope that the politician does whatever they want. But it is legal to involve a middleman, specifically a lobbyist. So if you, as a rich person, want the government to do something for you, you create a lobby and you hire a lobbyist who acts as a third party to give the money to the politician. So we definitely still have this relationship between the bourgeoisie and the political world. We do just frame it a little bit differently. Another thing that Marx claims that the bourgeoisie have done is to tear apart society. And this is a pretty common claim. Anytime you're trying to explain another group being bad, one of the things that people say is that they're tearing apart society. And often this is just shorthand for change. Nobody likes change. But Marx is arguing that they have made society worse. And I love how dramatic this language is. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. So his argument is that we used to live this like idealized pastoral lifestyle. We all knew each other, we respected each other, but now it's just a bunch of strangers who don't even know each other, can't make a deal, have to rely on cash because cash is so impersonal. He goes on to argue that they've also changed a lot of our social relationships. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with a reverent awe. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. So again, his argument is that they're tearing apart society by changing the way that we think about people who used to be powerful. So like we used to respect priests or teachers or community leaders, and now we pretty much only respect rich people and capitalists, in Marx's mind. He's also arguing that this is tearing apart family relations because money has become more important than blood ties. So again, this is dramatic language, and society was changing really hard at the time, but Marx is trying to pin all that blame on the capitalists. The next argument that he makes is that this capitalist way of living and of doing business is going to take over the whole world. And honestly, this is a pretty good argument. This did happen. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. And again, his language is super dramatic, but essentially what he's saying is true. If this is the style of economy that you create, you do need more and more people to trade with. You do need more and more factories, you need more and more people to work in those factories, and ultimately it does expand past the boundaries of where it started. This next paragraph is about the same thing. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e. to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. And again, this is dramatic, but he was right about this part. Basically, once capitalism, and again, this special mode of production was invented, it did kind of spread all over the world. It is continuing now to spread all over the world. So we have, for instance, gone through our capitalist industrialist revolution, but other countries are just now going through theirs, and other countries have yet to go through theirs. But at this point, it does look kind of inevitable. So his idea about needing to spread across the whole world and changing the countries that you find to sort of fit your mode was accurate. The next thing that Marx addresses, which is also kind of accurate, was what happens when you create this enormous workforce. So again, I know we've talked about this 100 times, but this was a very different kind of work. All of the people living in the cities, all of the people going to the factories. And it took a lot of people to make this happen. So his argument here is that they have created a whole population that did not exist before. In part, because the kind of work did not exist before. So here's what he says. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal production forces than have all preceding generations together. And again, this is true. People were producing things on a mass scale in a way that we had never seen before. His argument, however, is that that might ultimately work against them. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring its death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who will wield those weapons. The modern working class, the proletarians. So his argument is that there wasn't a working class until they made a working class, and that might ultimately be the thing that takes them down. He continues this thought. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all, by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. So this should sound pretty familiar. I assume you've heard the phrase, enslaved by the machine. You saw it in our Charlie Chaplin film. But basically the idea is that they created this working class, and then they kind of turn them into slaves. They turn them into machines. They turn them into something less than human. So his argument is that they meant to just make a bunch of employees for themselves, and instead they may have made a whole army of people who are prepared to take them down. One of the things Marx notes is that one reason that the workers are so unhappy is because their work sucks. And it doesn't just suck, it sucks in relation to their pay. So one of the things that he notices, for instance, is that in proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases. So it's not just that they've made this like army of employees, they've made this army of employees who are not getting paid enough to do the jobs that they're supposed to be getting paid for. And that the worse the job is, the worse the pay is. So for instance, I looked it up just in case. If you had a job as a porta potty cleaner, the people who go around and like vacuum up the contents of the porta potty, your average salary is going to be about $36,000 a year, which is better than poverty wages, but still very low. So you would think that, the worst jobs in society might have some financial compensation, but they don't, and they didn't then either. So Marx says this is going to make people kind of angry, because not only are they getting only a little tiny bit of money, the instant that you earn this money, it goes away again. No sooner is the exploitation of the laborer by the manufacturer at an end, that he receives his wages in cash, than he is set upon by the other portions of the bourgeoisie, the landlord, the shopkeeper, the pawnbroker, etc. So even though your employer might not also be your landlord, although sometimes they are, there's a whole class of other members of the bourgeoisie who are prepared to grab that money right out of your pocket. And this is true. I'm sure those of you who have earned a paycheck and then immediately spent it all on bills are familiar with this phenomenon. So basically what Marx argues is happening is that there are class struggles. And these class struggles come from really deeply unhappy people. And these deeply unhappy people are about to get political about it. So Marx makes it very simple. He says that this is a political problem and not a personal problem. He says that just because one class is experiencing and not another class doesn't mean it's not political, that in fact, every class struggle is a political struggle. So he says we have to stop pretending like this is just a thing that's happening or that's not a thing that we can control. He says that basically all of the problems that the working class people are having are a result of the political structure. So for instance, in modern times, we have issues with student loans. That's a class struggle and a political struggle. We have issues with the cleanliness of water, with how much we should pay for health care. And all of those things are both related to poverty and related to politics. And again, that's been happening for centuries. And Marx's argument is that one of the reasons that the workers are getting so political is because they are tired of being poor, which may sound familiar. So one of the ways that the bourgeoisie tried to keep this from happening, tried to keep the proletarians from uprising, was by pitting them against each other. And again, this may sound familiar. Very common to tell people who are at just a little bit of money that the people who have no money are after them. Wage labor rests exclusively on competition between the laborers. So again, this should sound familiar. We talked about this with Adam Smith, but it might also sound familiar in terms of like real life things. We hear very often that the immigrants are going to take our jobs, and that is a centuries old refrain. So basically creating competition between the wage laborers draws attention away from the people who are at the top and the people who are making the policies. So Marx notes, for instance, that there are fewer of the people who are at the top, the bourgeoisie, than there are proletarians. All previous historical movements were movements of minorities, or in the interest of minorities. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority, with the interests of the immense majority. So basically he's saying that previous movements might have seemed unrelated to you because they were on the part of a minority of people. But now he's saying, look, most of us are proletarians. The thing is that we super outnumber the bourgeoisie, and that's going to be important. For every company, typically, you're going to have about 278 workers to one CEO, sometimes way, way, way more than that. Which leads us to the next thought, which is that if the workers realize this, there's going to be trouble. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces is its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. So this was pretty hopeful thinking. You could argue this still hasn't happened, but he does make a good argument. Basically, if you piss off 98% of the population, it might go badly for that other 2%. And so his argument, and the argument basically of communists everywhere, is that the people who have the power should be the majority of people instead of the minority of people. And that's what he's going to try to argue in the next part. So part 2 is called Proletarians and Communists. And this is where he starts to actually introduce the concept of communism. So he starts by noticing that they need some structure. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties: formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. So just 3 things, right? But it's important that the first part is getting information. They have to get everybody together. They have to organize them into a class. From there, they can take on overthrowing the political powers and then ultimately having their own political power. But the first step is to get everybody involved in communism, and that is not going to be easy. So Marx jumps straight in with the concept of property. And this is one of the most important and least popular aspects of communism, so it's a good place to start. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. But the modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonisms, on the exploitation of the many by the few. So he says, we're not trying to abolish the concept of property, we're trying to abolish having it held exclusively in the hands of the bourgeois. So if you've seen the movie Parasite, you're sort of familiar with this concept, the idea that some people shouldn't have access to all of the good things. So Marx goes on to explain this a little bit better. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. So this is the thing that people hate. The idea that they're going to take your house, they're going to take your land, you're not going to have any private property anymore. Humans love private property. We spent a lot of time in Core 201 talking about private property. We even opened this semester with Rousseau's thoughts about private property and how it can make such a difference in terms of who is wealthy and who is not. And so Marx's idea here is that the whole problem is private property, so we should just get rid of it. He knows this is unpopular. He goes on to say, we communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as the fruit of a man's own labor, which property is alleged to be the groundwork of all personal freedom, activity, and independence. So he's like, yeah, I know. We think of our property as the result of our hard work. We think of our property as a tangible benefit that we have from having worked so hard. It's tied very closely to our freedom. It's tied to our independence. Having private property is so important to people, especially people of the Western world. However, he's ready for your arguments. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. Do you mean the property of the petty artisan and of the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There is no need to abolish that. The development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it, and is still destroying it daily. So basically he's like, oh, do you have private property? No, you don't. So Marx is being a little bit dramatic, but he's not wrong. Basically his argument is that the small shops, like the mom and pop shops, the small artisans, are being replaced by the big stores, by the more powerful companies. And this was something that did continue to be true. You've probably read about how main streets all over America are being shut down because people would rather shop at Walmart because it's cheaper. So that's kind of what he's talking about here, that basically a few people having a lot of wealth is putting all of the people with a little tiny bit of wealth out of business. So he simplifies this in the next part. Property in its present form is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor. Capital is, therefore, not a personal, it is a social power. So again, this is very similar to what Rousseau was arguing. Basically, that having property, having capital, gives you social power. That coming in with wealth only ever makes you more powerful. So Marx is being dramatic, but he's not totally wrong. So next, Marx talks about the minimum wage. And his language here is pretty strong. The average price of wage labor is the minimum wage, i.e., that quantum, the means of subsistence, which is absolutely requisite to keep the laborer in bare existence as a laborer. So this is a dramatic difference from Adam Smith's version of the minimum wage, which was basically enough for a man to provide for his family. Marx is saying that the minimum wage in reality is just barely enough to keep that worker alive. And so his argument here is that that's not going to cut it. That basically giving people only as much money as you are legally required to give them is not the right way to go forward. He thinks we should do it a different way. He thinks that labor should essentially have a different purpose. In bourgeois society, living labor is but a means to increase accumulated labor. In communist society, accumulated labor is but a means to widen, to enrich, to promote the existence of the laborer. So essentially what he's saying is that in the bourgeois society, the one that people are living in right now, the more you work, nothing better happens. Basically, you just accumulate labor on behalf of whoever owns the factory. So the harder and harder and harder you work, you don't get paid more. You just make more stuff. So essentially, all you've done is make stuff for someone else. But he's saying in the communist system, the harder and harder you work, the better your life will get. Because the products of your labor are shared equally among everyone. A pretty good argument. Basically that the more money you make for the man, the less you see, but the more money you make for yourself, the more there is to go around. So his argument has a lot to do with the individual and their place in society. He makes it a little bit clearer in this next part, where he says, in bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality, while the living person is dependent and has no individuality. So this is sort of like that idea that corporations are people. He's saying that basically wealth and power is more important than the individual. And that given the choice, people would rather accumulate wealth than treat individuals well. So he's saying that in the society they're living in, money is more important than people. And again, he's not necessarily wrong. So the next thing he does is to try to draw a connection between owning property and capital and why that means we should get rid of property. So basically, he's sort of doubling down on his argument from earlier, which is that no one owns property anyway except for the elite. You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property. People are horrified. But in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. So basically his argument here is like, oh, are you afraid I'm going to do away with property? Do you even have property? And his argument that 9/10 of people don't have property was a little overstated at the time and continues to be overstated. But he's not totally wrong. Basically, who owns property has a lot to do with how much social capital they have. So you guessed it, let's look at some graphs. In this first graph, we're looking at home ownership in America since 1995. And you'll notice that pretty much it goes up and down, but in our current state, a little more than half of people own homes. Probably about 65% of people own homes. This does, however, differ with what generation you're a part of. So of course, the silent generation has most of the homes, then the boomers, then Gen X, and millennials almost never have any houses. This has to do with accumulated wealth. The people who are older have more accumulated wealth, the people who are younger have less, and then of course the economy is broken, so millennials have nothing. That's a story for another day. In this final graph, you can see how there are some other factors at play. So for instance, rent has gone up, median home prices have gone up, private tuition has gone up, and income has gone up, but you'll notice not as much as everything else. So in a world where income has gone up on average 27%, but everything else has gone up on average much more than that, home ownership is increasingly unlikely. So while 9/10 is a little bit overstated, it is true that some people have property and some people don't, and there are crucial differences between them. The next argument Marx deals with is one of the classic arguments against communism, which is the idea that if we don't pay people for labor, they won't do any labor. It has been objected that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease and universal laziness will overtake us. The whole of this objection is but another expression of the tautology, that there can no longer be any wage labor when there is no longer any capital. So basically he's saying, yes, right now there is a relationship between hard work and pay, but if you take pay out of the equation, people will just work because people work. So he's saying that work does not have to be related to pay. Work can be related to survival, work can be related to meaning, work can be related to just wanting to help. But the fact that we have tied work to money is the problem, and we don't have to do it that way. So this is a little bit confusing, but basically his argument is people won't become lazy because there are other reasons to work other than paychecks. So next, Marx dives into this whole list of things that people are afraid communism will destroy. And I love this part because he gets really snarky. But basically, these are the things that people are worried about. That communism will destroy the family, that it will destroy child labor, that it will destroy traditional education, that it will introduce a community of women, that it will destroy traditional marriage, and that communists want to abolish countries and nationality. So these are pretty classic arguments. People are always afraid of change, but I wanted to focus on a few of them a little bit more carefully. So first, one of my personal favorites, which is that it will introduce a community of women. For the rest, it is self-evident that the abolition of the present system of production must bring with it the abolition of the community of women springing from that system, i.e., of prostitution, both public and private. So basically, what he's saying is that if women did not have to work for money, like prostitution, or if they did not have to marry for money, which some people argue is also prostitution, that we would have a whole community of free women who didn't necessarily have to participate to survive. So basically he's saying that what you're worried about is a bunch of women who might not need you, a bunch of women who could earn their own income, or a bunch of women who could survive without having to work. So if women no longer had to prostitute themselves to a husband, or prostitute themselves to a bunch of men, that maybe they wouldn't. I love this argument. He goes on to say that communists do want to destroy the concept of nations, because the same thing is happening in every nation. And so basically the workers of each nation are the same as each other. The working men have no country. National differences and antagonisms between people are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie, to the freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the mode of production, and in the conditions of life corresponding thereto. So he's saying that we used to be really different from one another based on where we came from, but now there are essentially just two classes of people, and all of the bourgeoisie are basically the same, and all of the workers are basically the same. That no matter what country you're in, if you are part of the proletariat, you have the same problems as every other person who's part of the proletariat. So when he says that the working men have no country, he doesn't mean that like they don't have passports. He means that they have all the same problems as each other, no matter where they are in the world. Marx goes on to draw a parallel between one individual holding another individual down and one country holding another country down. In proportion, as the exploitation of one individual by another is put an end to, the exploitation of one nation by another is put an end to. In proportion, as the antagonism between classes within the nation vanishes, the hostility of one nation to another will come to an end. So he's saying that basically one wealthy capitalist nation holding down a less wealthy nation, or just dividing it amongst themselves, will come to an end with communism. And this was happening. Like if we look at this map, on the left we can see the traditional tribal boundaries of Africa until 1880, when the Treaty of Berlin allowed a lot of the more powerful Western countries to just kind of divide up Africa however they wanted. So basically the capitalist countries, the bourgeois countries, came here to a nation that didn't yet have industrial development and just sort of divided it up. And what he's saying is that if communism were more prevalent, this kind of thing wouldn't happen. That basically the nations could get along peacefully because there wouldn't be that same constant war over resources. Hard to say if this one would have worked out, but it's a pretty compelling argument. I included this next part just because I love it so much. The charges against communism made from a religious, a philosophical, and generally from an ideological standpoint are not deserving of serious examination. I don't know what happened here. I don't know if he really thinks that those are just not deserving, or if he was like tired and this was late so he just wrote that. But either way, I love the way that he was just like, no, I'm not even going to engage with that. So, alright. So now he comes to what is essentially the thesis of part 2, which is that if we're going to make change, we have to question the very foundations of our society. The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. So basically he's saying you don't have to just sit there and be like, this is fine. You can instead question the ideas of the ruling class. Why are they telling you that certain things are real? Why are they telling you that certain things are important? Why did they behave in a way that is different than what they said that you should do? So basically he's saying usually the whole society believes whatever the ruling class believes. And we should change that. The history of all past society has consisted in the development of class antagonisms. Antagonisms that assume different forms at different epochs. But whatever form they may have taken, one fact is common to all past ages: the exploitation of one part of society by another. So he's saying this isn't uncommon, that one part of society exploits another part of a society. And it isn't uncommon that one part of a society just believes whatever they were told. But if we want change, we have to question what we were told. We have to be prepared to kind of put it all in a bag and throw it away. That's hard to do, and he acknowledges that that's hard to do. But he's saying that if we want big change, we have to switch to big ideas. And that's why we're about to hear their list of demands. So that brings us to Marx and Engels' list of demands. Basically, they made this list of 10 things that they think that we should change. Some of them are okay. Some of them are terrible. Let's go through them. So first, abolition of private property. Abolition of property and land, and application of all rents of land to public purposes. So basically, all of the land is owned by everybody, and if you rent a piece of land, like a house, basically that money just goes back into the public pot. So the same way that like parks are generally public property, everything would be public property, and if you wanted to rent it, you would have to pay. All right. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax. You may have heard about this recently. We've been talking about doing this one again. Basically, if you make more money, you pay a higher percentage of that in taxes. Abolition of all right of inheritance. This one is unpopular. People really like to pass down their wealth to their future generations, but his argument is that that's part of the problem, is that we start to see intergenerational wealth, and instead we should just put that wealth back in the public pot, so that instead of being born rich, you're born the same as everybody else. So it's not necessarily that you can't accumulate, it's just that you can't hand it down when you die. Again, people didn't like this one. Confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. So basically, if you leave the country on purpose, we're keeping your house. And if you do something dangerous and rebellious that's against us, we're keeping your house. So basically, anyone who's against us forfeits their right to their property. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. So part of everybody sharing the wealth and like getting proceeds from rents is just having one bank. All of the money goes to the bank. Again, this seems reasonable, but this is hugely problematic. Anytime anyone has tried this, it's gone real wrong. Basically, having one bank be in charge of everything, as it turns out, doesn't go well because people don't handle it with as much moral structure as perhaps we would like. So this is one of the ones that turns ugly in the real world, although it does kind of make sense. Centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Again, seemingly reasonable. What if there was just really good public transportation? What if there was just one phone company and you didn't have to shop around for prices? The problem, again, is that in practice, it can get unscrupulous very quickly. So basically, it'd be cool if we all had public transportation, but not if MARTA designed it, right? So it would be nice if there was only one system of these things, but what we have found is that that leads pretty quickly to some bad behavior, so that one didn't work out as well as we would like. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. The bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. So this one is kind of interesting. Basically, all the factories would be owned by the state, which we anticipated, but also all of the agriculture would be owned by the state. And having sort of one overarching plan for all of the agriculture could be useful, but having one overarching plan for all of the factories, again, could kind of go wrong. So this one is kind of two plans at the same time, neither one of which have been particularly successful. equal liability of all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. So we'll talk more later about the concept of equal liability of all to labor. But what that really means is that you work as much as you are able to, from each according to their abilities. So basically, just because you're not getting paid for your labor doesn't mean you're not doing labor. Everybody has a job, everybody has to help. Basically, you can't just lay around and hope that we'll bring you food. You have to help us make the food. The other part, which I think is really interesting, is an industrial agricultural army. An interesting idea. If we need a lot of food, we need a lot of people to grow the food, so maybe they could be an organized force. The next one is about population. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. Basically, why have them be separate? Why not acknowledge that sometimes agriculture is part of industrial production? Gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. This one's a little weird, but basically he wanted to even out the numbers of populations so that there weren't a bunch of people in the city and then a few people in the country. He wanted to sort of space everybody out more equitably. So this map is kind of a representation of that. If we divided the whole United States population equitably, this is how many of us would live in each place. Again, people don't really like this. People love cities and people love the countryside, but it's an interesting idea to try to get a more even distribution of people all around the land. It certainly would make voting more interesting. And finally, free education for all children in public schools, and abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. Shocking, right? I told you, not all the ideas are bad. You may have noticed that you grew up not working in a factory. You may have gone to one of these free schools, so communist. So, again, some of the ideas are kind of weird, and some of them were popular, and we kept them. An interesting list of demands. So Marx ends this section by talking about political power and trying to wrap it all up. Political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing the other. In place of the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. So basically he's saying that once we get rid of private property, we can get rid of class antagonism, and everybody will be allowed to peacefully prosper. It's a noble dream. Did it work? We'll talk about that next week. So, as always, I look forward to talking about this with you in class, and if you have any questions, please send me an email.